How many of you know Ron Wayne? How many of you know who that is? Good. It'll make it a lot easier for me if you guys don't. Ron Wayne was an engineer. He was in his 40s, and he met two young bucks in their 20s who had this idea, and he got roped in with them, started helping them form a company. And he said working with the two of them was like trying to hold the tiger by the tail. It just was wearing him out. And he's looking at their energy, he's looking at their big dreams, and he's thinking, I don't think this is going to happen. And I'm afraid that they're going to get so far into debt that I'm going to have to pay some of it back. So he decided to sell out his portion. Now, he had 10% of the company. Each of these two guys had 45%. So he's just going to sell out and be done with it. And they sit down and they agree on the price, $800. So they wrote him a check for $800, and he was done and glad of it. That company was Apple, and the other two partners were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. If he had kept that 10%, it probably would have turned into something around 800 million, or 80 million, excuse me. Probably would have been about $80 million there. But he wasn't all sad that he let it go, because that $80 million, he said, would have made him the richest man in the cemetery. He just didn't think he could do this. So maybe he made the right choice. Financially, wasn't the world's best investment, though, was it? No, financially it wasn't. He's not alone, though. A lot of people have made some bad investments. One of my favorites was 20th Century Fox back in the day. 20th Century Fox was making a low-budget film in a genre that wasn't real popular. They didn't have a lot of faith in this movie, but the director really did. And the director kept pushing for this movie. And the director came to them and said, listen, I'll tell you what, I will take $20,000 less in salary if you will just give me the merchandising rights to this movie. Back in the 1970s, merchandising rights didn't amount to that much. $20,000 was a lot of money. So 20th Century Fox jumped at that deal with George Lucas making a movie called Star Wars. Those merchandising rights sent millions into his pockets. And I think about 20,000 of it came from the toys I bought for Star Wars back when I was a kid. Yeah, it was good investment for George Lucas, not so good for 20th Century Fox. So who else do we have here? We have George Bell. And George Bell, back in the 90s, was doing his own company called Excite, and it was a web portal, and it was making some waves. It was doing some good things. And a couple young people, they came up to him, and they said, we have some new algorithms, some new things. We'd like to sell you for $1 million. And he thought, no, I don't want that. And so they came back to him and they said, how about $750,000? And he said no, and they went on their way. They ended up not selling out, and their little startup is what we call Google, which is now worth roughly 1 million times what they had offered to sell it to it for, at about $750 billion. I think that might be the origination of the now well-known phrase, dope! But my personal favorite was Eastman Kodak. Do you guys remember Eastman Kodak? Do you know, this is not a well-known fact, but it was some of their engineers who first developed the technology for digital cameras. And they approached the bigwigs of the company and we said, this is the future. And Eastman Kodak said, no. The bigwigs of the company said, we're a film company. We do film. We're the lion's share of the market. We're the big ones. There's a market for film. We do film. What they didn't understand is there was no market for film. Nobody wanted to buy film. People wanted photos. They wanted pictures. And digital was a better way to do that. And by, was it 2006 or 2007, Eastman Kodak went bankrupt. They died out, basically. They're still around in some form, but they practically died out because they didn't see the potential of this. And isn't that the way it works? Don't so many of us see the value of one thing that we lose sight of the value of something else? Isn't it so easy to get caught on what we're looking at that we miss a bigger picture? We've all done that, haven't we? We've all been there at one point or another. We're doing a series right now called Flipped. And we are in week 5 out of 6 weeks where we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And we're calling it Flipped because Jesus flipped the world upside down with his teachings. If you look back through history, what has happened because of the Christian movement, you will see that our culture, our world, has changed drastically by everything that Jesus established. And in the Sermon on the Mount, we've been talking about how Jesus goes up on a mount. Matthew was laying out an image of a new Moses establishing a new kingdom. And in the Sermon on the Mount, in those 3 chapters, he is laying down a new law for this kingdom. And the first week, he had an invitation to join this kingdom, but he didn't go to those who you would think a kingdom would need. He went to those who would need the kingdom, and he invited them in. And the second week, we looked at salt and light, where Jesus said, okay, now if you're going to take part of this kingdom, this is what you do. You become part of this movement, and you work in it, and as you do, this movement is going to reach past its own 4 walls, and it's going to impact the culture around you. Then in the other 2 messages that we just finished, and in the last 2, Jesus starts to get very practical with a lot of things on what this kingdom looks like. And today we're going to look at one aspect of this where Jesus challenges us to invest in what matters most. Jesus says, in this kingdom, we're going to first and foremost value God. That is our greatest priority. Our second priority is the people that he puts around us in life. Our second priority is people, and things, possessions, are way down on the list. And that is going to be how our kingdom is going to look. He challenges us first to invest in that which lasts the longest and matters the most. Now, my wife and I, we tried to do this when we're on our honeymoon. See, my wife and I got married in college. If you don't know, in college has another shorter equivalent in English called poor. They're synonyms to each other. And because of my Army College Fund, because I was able to do homework at work and work more hours that way, we did better than most college students, but we were far from rich. And we're getting married, and we have a choice to make. Do we get a better, more reliable car, or do we go on a nicer honeymoon? And that seemed like a pretty easy choice to us. The car will last longer, right? I wasn't completely thinking this through, though, because the car lasted for 9 years. The marriage, we're coming up on 30. Could I have missed something here when we were making up this choice? Could I have missed that? Could I have accidentally communicated to her that I was more concerned with my car than making memories? That I was more concerned with what I drove than investing in our relationship? I could have communicated that very easily, couldn't I have? Fortunately, it all worked out really, really well. What happened is, our nightmare was a disaster. Sometime I'll have to tell you the story and you guys can laugh along with us. But our honeymoon ended up being such a disaster that we ended up laughing about it to this day, and we still make jokes about it. And it became a bonding experience for us. What happened is, our first anniversary, I made sure to do something really nice for the 2 of us. What happened is, a few years later, I had a family heirloom, something that was precious to me, and I sold it so I could take her out for a nicer anniversary. And she saw that I was willing to invest in both. So it all worked out okay in the end. But it was a lesson for me. I started to watch myself a little bit more. How am I communicating her value to her? Am I valuing stuff over her? And how do I make sure she knows that I won't do that? That's a small picture of a much greater image that Jesus is laying out for us, a much greater call. That's a tiny picture of a much greater principle. And let's look at where Jesus starts to do this in the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to look at Matthew 6. We're going to start with verses 19 to 21. And I am going to ask throughout this, and I may have forgotten to underline them, but if you see any underlined words, I'll ask you to say them with me. But I may have forgotten to go through and do that. It says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What's in your heart? What are you focused on? What are you looking at? What gets to the core of your heart? If you take an outsider who doesn't know you, who does not have the emotional attachments to what you have, and you let them sit for 10 minutes with your check register and your calendar, they will tell you what's in your heart. What are we investing in? You can see right there. Jesus is saying that needs to be first and foremost things done for God. That needs to be first and foremost our walk with Him. That needs to be first and foremost our care for our faith and making that a priority in our life. Secondly, it's our relationship with other people. Secondly, it's investing in those around us and those He puts around us. Because the truth is, the stuff of this life will bring pleasure for a time, won't it? I mean, it's fun to get a new toy, isn't it? Come on, guys. Us men, we like our toys, don't we? The only difference between an adult male and a little boy is the cost of the toy. But we both like getting the toy, don't we, guys? Women, you're not a whole lot different if you're honest. My wife has more shoes than Imelda Marcos, or those of you who remember her. But we like getting our stuff. And when we do, it brings pleasure for a time, doesn't it? But Jesus is trying to warn us that pleasure will fade. That pleasure won't last. What we invest in Him will last. There's going to be a day, 100, 110 years from now, where none of us in this room are going to still be on this earth. We'll still be having a relationship with God. Nothing that we invested in here on this life will have lasted. So Jesus says, put your investment in that which matters the most and that which will last the longest. That's not the direction our society pushes us, is it? Our world does not push us to do that. Our world has some powerful advertising in it. And everywhere we go, we get bombarded by these ads. And these ad agencies, they have strategies, they have tools, they have things that they do to make you think your life will not be complete, you will not be happy unless you have what they are selling. They have their strategies to say, oh boy, if you invest in this, then your relationships will be good. And you'll see that in beer ads. You never see a person alone drinking beer. You see them always in a party with a group of friends. Do this and it'll be for your friendships. It'll be for your relationships. Is it really? No, it's about buying their product. And we get this sort of pressure all the time. It's called consumerism, and we live in a society driven at times by consumerism. But that's not the only thing that pressures people to want more stuff. It's not always about greed. Sometimes it's about a deeper need. Sometimes it's about something very real and very powerful that anyone can fall into. And that's a desire for safety. It's a desire for security, and we feel enough money, enough items, enough things, and then we'll be secure. And it's interesting. You ask a person who's on the very bottom of the economic rungs, how much does it take for you to be happy? What would make you happy? And most people will answer somewhere between 10 and 15% more. You find the guy that makes $500,000 a year and lives in a huge house, how much will it take to make you happy? The answer is somewhere between 10 and 15% more. Because we're not worried about happiness per se. What we're looking for is security. We're looking to feel better, feel stronger. And this is a very real principle in our lives. There was a man named Daniel Gilbert. Now, some of you remember in 2009, our culture faced a huge economic downturn. And he was writing about that. And he started talking about how it's not the money that was the issue for so many people's fear during all that. It was their uncertainty. And he wrote this article that was entitled, What You Don't Know Makes You Nervous. And he used a lot of examples, but one that stood out to me was a Dutch experiment. And in this Dutch experiment, they had people come in and they strapped them to electrodes. And they were told, we are going to give you 20, not life-threatening, but 20 very strong, somewhat painful shocks. And they would go through 20 shocks and then go home, wondering, why did I just do that? What's the point of the experiment? Well, then they had a second group come in. And they said, we're going to give you 20 shocks. Now, 3 of them, they're not going to be life-threatening, but they'll be somewhat painful. 17 of which will be very mild. You'll barely feel them. The thing is, you're not going to know which it's going to be until it happens. So you believe me, they're counting the shocks. They're trying to see when that third one happens, and then they know the others will be mild and they can lighten up. These people in the second group sweat more, their heart rate went up more, their eyes were flickering more. There was much more sign of nervousness and fear in the second group than in the first, because the second group was wondering. And this principle really shows through. When we don't feel secure, when we don't know what the future will bring, we'll try to collect stuff because we feel it'll give us a sense of security. And I do that too. Gilbert, in this article, he says this about it, how it applies. He says, an uncertain future leaves us stranded in an unhappy present with nothing to do but wait. Our national gloom is real enough, but it isn't a matter of insufficient funds. It's a matter of insufficient certainty. How many of us have been there at some point in our life? If we learn to put our relationship with God first and find certainty and safety in that, that cannot be taken from us. And we don't need to gain more for it. This is what Jesus says matters most. But we live in a society that's driven by consumerism, fear. We live in a society that points to safety if you have a lot of money in the bank account and all that. And in this society, there's this pressure that develops. Get the stuff, don't worry about the people. And our priorities start to get switched, don't they? And that's something that happens inside the church and out. So I started coming across videos and stories and news clips this last week of something that's just too far common, just happens way more than we would ever want it to. But how many of you who have been parents have ever gotten really tired when the baby's keeping you up a lot at night, something like that? You go to the store and you almost forget to take the baby out of the car. Some people have forgotten to take the baby out of the car, and they're not bad parents or anything. But some little kids have been left in some pretty hot cars sometimes. And what struck me in all these stories is how many people would sit around afraid to break the window to rescue the kid because they were afraid of a lawsuit. What's being prioritized there, money or the child? You see how that's seeping into our culture? Well, one lady who had 2 children of her own, a mom, she did it a little different.
A child left locked in a hot car. It's a nightmare for any parent, but in Kansas last weekend, it wasn't the child's parents who came to the rescue. It was a local store manager whose concern for the child pushed her into action.
In the cell phone video, you can hear and see the desperate attempts to break a car window. That woman swinging a tire iron is Sarah Orpeza.
It was just very, very emotional for all of us that were around.
The manager at Famous Footwear was ringing someone up at 4:15 when one of her workers ran inside screaming for help.
The windows were totally up. All the doors were locked. She was covered in sweat. Like when I looked in the window, she pulled her hair back and sweat was just drip, drip, drip. I was just getting so mad that it wouldn't break. And I was just praying, like, break the window. She's going to die.
This video only shows seconds of the 2 to 3 minutes Sarah says it took to even get a crack. Every whack at the window felt like an eternity for the mom of 2 trying to save this girl's life.
She was crying and she was drenched in sweat. Like her shoes were wet. Like she was so drenched in sweat. And I just started crying.
Tears only turned to anger, she says, as the couple supposedly caring for the little girl came inside the shoe store.
No emotion at all whatsoever. They sat there, and the only question that they had for the police is if insurance was going to cover the window that we broke. That's the only question that they asked the cops.
Now, a nurse who happened across the scene gave the 2-year-old medical care. The child was later picked up by her grandmother. Police ticketed the couple for child endangerment. For 11 News Now, I'm Joe Arena.
I don't know why the video for the newscaster, where the audio didn't come through there, it worked fine on my computer. I apologize for that. If you didn't hear, the couple was ticketed for child endangerment. Nothing happened to the store manager, rightfully so. The state they were in has a Good Samaritan law that protected her, but still most people were afraid to get involved. And she wasn't. But if you didn't hear when the couple who supposedly were caring for this child came in. I'm assuming the parents, they never once thanked anyone for getting the child out of the car. They didn't thank the nurse who showed up, who helped offer care. Their only question was, how much will it cost? Where was their priority? Are they valuing relationships or possessions more? We're going to get into our next thing here where Jesus encourages us to focus on what brings us the most lasting joy. He says in the next verses of this sermon, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, that's an important word. In Greek, it's got two meanings. It means healthy. It also means generous. If your eye is looking to give to others, if your eye is looking for where to invest, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, stingy, if your eyes are focused on what I can gain for myself, on me, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? You don't develop a quality of life that makes you happy when you focus on the wrong things. If your eyes are looking to be generous, you find joy in life because you find places to give of yourself and invest in. You build better relationships. You find pleasure with God, and all of a sudden you are enjoying your quality of life. If your eye is about self, we start to lose that. And that is something that many people will tell you is true. It's all about focus. So some of you might be old enough to remember this, but Flight 401, back in, I believe it was 1972. I don't really remember the event, but I've heard a lot of references to it later on. So some of you who weren't even alive then may be familiar with this. It's pretty famous. But what happened is this flight was flying from New York to Miami. And as they're getting close to Miami, they go to lower their landing gear, but the little light doesn't come on to say that the landing gear are deploying. And so they had somebody from the ground confirm, yeah, the landing gear are working. But just to be safe, they pulled the landing gear up back in, and they went into a holding pattern at 6,000 feet circling while they fixed this light. And they got so wrapped up in fixing this light bulb that none of the pilots were monitoring their altitude. And they went lower and lower and lower until they crashed into the Everglades, killing 163 people. I believe there were something like 27 survivors of the event, but 163 people died because their focus was on the wrong thing. They focused on the minor and not the major. And that's what happens when we go through life, living with a priority that doesn't include God, living with a priority that doesn't include our relationships with Him and with others. There's an internal death that happens the same way. And this leads to our last thing. Jesus really wants us to own our possessions and not be owned by them. So He tells us this in 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Everybody's owned by something. We want to think we're free. And we do have some freedoms. We have the freedom to choose our focus. We have freedoms to choose where we invest in. But if we put our investment in our possessions, they soon own us because it's never enough. How many of us have ever gotten that new toy that we wanted so much, and after a couple weeks we've had it, we've played with it, and now our eye starts to look around for the next toy, and we lose pleasure in this one because now I'm after this. Have any of us done that? I have. And not just as a child. Who was owning who at that point? We're all going to be a slave to something. We get to choose what we can be a slave to. Possessions are a terrible master. Possessions never do well. They never end where we want them to end. They never fulfill. They never satisfy. Now, does all this mean that you shouldn't have toys? No, you should. I have my toys, but I try to make sure that my toys are something I can use to meet with others, connect with others, and influence them for Jesus. So you guys know I have a really strange hobby. I shoot pellet guns, high-end European ones, not like what you get at Walmart. Odd hobby, I know. But what happened is I joined a group that had the same hobby where I just moved from, and I got to interact with unchurched people for it. And that toy became a part of my relationship with God. There's nothing wrong with having toys. It's about our focus. It's about our priority and where we're going to put that. You know who tends to have really good focus, really good priority? You thought I'd forgotten you, moms. No. We're going to finish today's service. After our last song, we're going to have some treats for you. And here's what our treat is, Mom. I'm going to send them some bags of candy with you. You ever notice that a mom's kiss is magic? A mom's kiss cures all sorts of things, doesn't it? Mom's kiss heals many things. So we're going to send a couple kisses. Mom, you're a lifesaver. So we've got a couple lifesavers in here for you ladies. And remember, if you are somebody who is above the age of, say, 18, and you are a lady in this room, I am inviting you to participate because we all have ways that we find others to invest in. We all have ways to give. And Mom, we have one of these really good Linzer truffles in there because I know you moms. You know what happens? Whenever there's only one piece of pie left at dinner, you seem to never be hungry. Moms always give too much. So I give you my permission to use one of the Lifesavers or one of the Hershey's Kisses to distract the kids, and you munch on this. Because we want you moms to know we appreciate you. And there have been so many times our moms have done just an absolutely wonderful job of caring for us, prioritizing us over themselves. What a great image of what I'm talking about today. And there's so many times our moms have pointed us towards Jesus. There are so many times our moms have helped us to see the love, the grace that He pours out. There are so many times that our moms have stirred in us a passion for Him. So we're going to ask the worship team to come forward. We're going to sing the Revelation song, and we're going to do what so many of our moms have done, and we're going to worship Jesus. We're going to go in the direction they've tried to point us. And at the end of that song, when we do the benediction, I've asked to have the children come in, and they're going to hand out these bags to our ladies in this room today. Let's worship God.